What's going on, everybody? It's Frito here for Clickheads. The Valorant community has been up in arms due to Riot's controversial decision to not bring solo queue to Valorant, despite it being a popular mode in League of Legends. Today, we'll cover both sides of the argument as well as our stance on the controversy. This has popped up after the recent blog post where Ian Fielding, product manager of Valorant Competitive, explained their philosophy on competitive play. He says here, why does Valorant allow any pre-made size for ranked? Why not a true solo queue? It's important to us that competitive matchmaking in Valorant is focused on team play because we believe that playing as a team is a major component in your overall mastery of the game. If players have a group of teammates they perform well with, we don't want to discourage them and set a precedent that the real test of skill is in solo play. Having a solo queue can easily lead to that becoming the definitive test of someone's skills and the primary way to play competitively. We opted instead to allow players to play at any team size they prefer. We also think it's valuable for players to search for good teammates now for competitive play, so when higher stakes competition becomes available, they already have teammates they can rely on. If you are playing solo or with smaller groups, we've worked to make it so our matchmaker will favor placing players against similar pre-made team sizes. Also, outside of playing at the highest rank, we've included measurement on a small degree of performance in determining how your rank increases or decreases. So if you perform exceptionally well and have an outsized contribution to your team's win, you'll rank up faster. Now, this statement angered many players who don't want to feel they need to group in order to compete against them and would prefer to be judged in an environment that emphasized solo plays. As this debate heated up, another Riot dev, senior designer for Valorant, Dravarius, chimed in, doubling down on this stance, saying this seems like a good time to discuss our long-term intent for competitive play in Valorant. While we want it to be easy for players to get in and immediately start competing, we always viewed coordinated team play as the ultimate goal and expression of ranked play. Ideally, and eventually, we want to give our players a ranked experience that is much closer to competing at a professional level than any other game out there. And we want the path to pro to be something that all players can clearly see in-game. This is why the current competitive mode and queue rules are built to encourage team play. We want players to start building teams now. Ian Fielding said this as well. He goes on to say, in the future, expect us to expand upon the ranked experience with modes that will engage teams directly. On the other hand, we recognize that players don't have pocket teams they can pull out at any time they need them, and we intend to keep the competitive queue solo queue friendly and accessible. This is part of why we support things like individual player performance and having impact on your overall rank. A little bit of repeats in those two statements, but I think combining both of them, we get the overall picture of everything that they intend to do. And they said a lot there, so there's a lot to break down. Dravarius states that Riot has a few principles that they're following with their decision, providing the most competitive experience out there, and basically warning us that we better stockpile a friends list of fraggers if we want to play ranked, because not only are they sticking to this philosophy, one step further, he seems to imply that in-game tournaments or maybe a full team queue or something similar may be coming to the game soon, because that's the focus of Valorant in their view. Sure, you can choose to go solo or duo if you want, and with personal performance metrics to help affect your rank, you always are incentivized to perform better, but as they've already said in various different places, winning is the most important thing. So it stands to reason that tactics in the game may overvalue individual performance, but is that necessarily a bad thing? Kind of debatable. Reviewing the other post from Ian Fielding, Fielding seems to imply that if there were a solo queue, it would basically overshadow grouping in ranked entirely, which I most definitely think is true. The problem is most players want to solo queue. Grouping, no matter what, even when they emphasize it to the maximum degree, just isn't going to be the most popular way to play. At this point, I'm going to let loose with our hot take on this. I want to explain that I just came from Overwatch, which has brutally punished stacks for the past 4 years, and I have to say that I'm 100% down for allowing teamwork to dominate the ladder. And you're obviously free to disagree, but I want to break down the difference in what sets the meta when you allow one version over the other. I could definitely see why solo players don't want to play up against teams. It's way harder, but I think it's actually good for the integrity of the competitive system. I'll explain explain the benefits of solo queue too, but the truth is solo queue only is less competitive and more casual. And I think my own personal experience with Valorant sets a really good example of this. You see, I'm not a very good Valorant player. Not yet anyway. I haven't grinded my skills or knowledge enough to really start to climb. However, I've played CS for years in the past, so I can play in solo queue and kind of hold my own. Just play my own angles and pull out a lot of cheesy tactics that can isolate 1v1s against a disorganized team. In solo queue, not just in Valorant, but in every game I've ever played, the tactics are at like 10 to 20% capacity. And Valorant is no different. People either just split for default map control, play for picks, or rush one site. Either style is really obvious and easy to engage with without much teamwork as a solo player. Whereas if you play against a group, they may be doing full executes on sites or pulling rotations for fakes, covering each other's angles much better, watching the flank much better, overall just doing much more complicated strategies with their teamwork and utility, making for the game sense in that type of lobby far higher. But in truth, what I want to emphasize is that grouping in Valorant, even as is right now, isn't as easy as it sounds, because when you group, as they've already said, you are more likely to play against other groups. And this simply just makes the game harder, more hardcore, and more competitive all around. Because when both teams are grouped, well, both teams are attempting to engage in that higher level strategy, right? I've barely had the chance to group in Valorant thus far. I've mostly played solo queue, and I can attest that the games felt like 5 times harder when you're up against a group. I got absolutely clowned. All of my offbeat tactics, where I normally would just take a dry peek on an awkward timing to win a 1v1 duel, now I'm facing into a crossfire where I always get traded even if I do get that first kill, or get outplayed by utility, or any number of other tactics that frankly should be how we define the base gameplay of Valorant. I would call this the actual game. It's an entirely different experience to everyone picking mostly duelists, splitting across the map and taking 1v1s all game. When you play in that group meta, you have to be much more disciplined in how you engage with the elements of the game and take everything much more seriously. All your decisions have much more brutal ramifications because there's less errors for everyone to make across the board. No matter what rank you're playing at, by the way, this scales up the ranks. I know how horrible it can feel to play against a team. As I've already described, I got destroyed. Thus far trying it, I have a lot to learn. But in truth, the alternative to me is far worse and creates a far more casual experience. What should rank actually promote? Should I just be able to take dumb peeks and out-aim everyone to victory to get to a high rank? Or should I actually have to learn teamwork and discipline? To me, the answer is simple. If we want a more competitive game, letting teamwork set the ranked meta is the only way to do it. Now, I know there's notable community members that would harshly disagree with this. Streamers like Mendo and Defran speak from a far higher elo experience than I do, and I do see the argument that at the highest level, where almost all the players in the lobby are reaching the apex of the skill curve, a pre-made versus a non-pre-made sounds impossible to overcome due to the internal synergy in that team. All of these things are just amplified at the highest tier, and even if everyone is individually on the same route to maximizing the mechanics of Valorant, with such little gap to outplay your opponent mechanically because everyone's so good, any coordination will beat a lack of coordination a big percentage of the time. But even if a team rises to prominence in Valorant to be dominant like Astralis is in CSGO, yes, they could likely do some damage in ranked, but here's my counterpoint. If you consider yourself deserving as the same rank as them, how does it make sense that you should have no chance to beat them in a random map best of one? If that is the case, then they probably deserve an extra classification like top 500 or something above Valorant rank. If they can reliably beat everyone at the top rank, right? Like there should be a way for the system to be able to just mark that, separate the gods from the demigods. There's lots of ways they can do this. You know, maybe pre-made teams have their own separate SR and you have to do a few placements with that group in order to place that team, and then you maybe have a solo SR. That's one way they could go about doing it while still keeping the philosophy of allowing groups to do that. That way you could keep your pre-made having its own stats, its own record, while hopefully having the best of both worlds with solo queue. I don't know, I just make videos. I'm not an actual designer, but that's just one idea, right? But even with that being a concern, I think the truth is that even the best teams don't play ranked perfectly or every scrim perfectly like they'd attempt to for a tournament. Instead, rated games will play out more like scrims where even the best teams can have an off map while they try new strats or just not perform at their peak for whatever reason. Another point that I think might sway you on this is that incentivizing that team play actually empowers the meaning of solo queue. And here's why. Remember earlier when I talked about my own cheesy solo queue tactics that work against solos but is just dog against pre-mades? Well, here's the truth. If they were to make a solo queue, then that solo queue meta gameplay would just be the norm all the time. And it would be very difficult to achieve those higher level tactics that can exist. And because of that, well, solo queue just means less. In the same way that even Face It is taken with a grain of salt in the CSGO community, then solo queue would as well. And I know defendants of solo queue would argue this, so let me chime in to play devil's advocate to my own point. Normally, it's the philosophy that you want solo queue because there's an assumption that no matter what, ranked isn't going to be serious, and on the path to pro, you want to find the best solo players and then mold them into team players, right? Like you find the good fundamentals and mechanics and basics out of solo play in disorganized or puggy style gameplay, and then you teach them and coach them up to be team players. But I would argue that playing up against teams automatically does that. It brings them right into the fold and forces them to learn the actual game. Just like I will have to if I keep playing up against groups that are crossfiring me on every dumb peek I take, right? This is a bold strategy from Riot because that's what they're saying. They want the ranked experience to actually be legitimate for once, because the truth is, if you do routinely play up against Astralis, even if you get whooped, putting up footage against them on stream is way more legit than just clowning on a bunch of randoms, even if you lose that match reliably, right? I think an argument can be made that it's obviously less fun, it's less forgiving, but I don't see the argument that solo queue is more competitive. I think it's just an easier route to success, whereas having to beat top level tactics is simply harder and a much more difficult expression of the game. Remember, I speak from Overwatch experience, where the past 4 years, there's been huge punishments for grouping. It's not even allowed at the highest ranks, but the matchmaker harshly skews against any group, so much so that it isn't even really a viable way to gain rank. Solo queue is way easier to gain rank because of the reasons I'm explaining. And part of that is already in Valorant right now, right? The same thing of pitting groups against groups creates this two-tiered system where the same rank doesn't necessarily mean the same thing. Because in one route, there's a solo queue meta, and on another route, there's the team play meta, where surprisingly, the thing I noticed with Overwatch, and I think is true with Valorant as well, is that pre-made groups, even of medium skill rating, are attempting to employ the same type of team strategies that the pros use, whereas even the top rank in solo queue Grandmaster in Overwatch is kind of a clown fiesta, where it's very, very common that teams and players simply don't know how to take map control or what angles or paths to take, how to work as a team, and very basic things don't get done that any pre-made group would be able to do. But as stated earlier, it's viewed that that system is to promote just individual mechanics more rather than actual game knowledge and deeper understanding of the game. But maybe I'm just a nerd with these kind of things, but that's what I think actually matters. If we play in a system where it's all solo all the time and your team isn't executing strats and the enemy team is barely executing strats, well, no one has to learn anything. And you can get by playing the game in a way that simply flat out doesn't work against the group, instilling very bad habits. This works in Overwatch. I think this works in Valorant as well. If you take a solo player who's never played in a team before and plop them right into a team, they're going to look like a fish out of water at the same rank where they were comfortable playing in solo. From my Overwatch experience, I would say doing this, typically a player would know something between like 10 to 20% of how much they actually should know about the overall game and have a much more watered down understanding of all the tactics that exist in the team v team matchup. It's this sort of game sense wasteland that I'm trying to avoid happening in Valorant again. And I know this is going to be a controversial take, and many of you are going to disagree with our stance on this, but I don't want ranked to be a joke. If they do make it solo queue, it almost necessitates a third-party matchmaker or different pipelines for the path to pro. But I'm actually excited to see a rated system that I can take seriously for once. I know a lot of players just want to jump in as Jet and take 1v1 duels all day, but I think that's a casual attitude to a competitive experience, and instead I would just prefer that they added more casual modes to find that gameplay experience, and it's not really for competitive play in my opinion. But that is just our opinion. Let us know your thoughts in the comment section down below. If you enjoyed the video, even if you disagreed, please be sure to leave it with a like. It really does help us out and lets us know that you're enjoying the content. And if you haven't already, hit subscribe so you actually get notified when our videos go live. That's been it for me. I've been Frito for Clickheads. We'll see you guys next time.